While 94% of us on this call have not used virtual currencies ourselves, 40% of Americans have, which is up from 30 last year. Um, what we'll talk about throughout this presentation is Bitcoin, and in particular, machines called Bitcoin kiosks or ATMs, which are now pretty prolific in our state. It's about 300 of them in Massachusetts alone. The market for these Bitcoin kiosks is about $123 million as of last year, and there are about 40,000 of them across the world. This will provide kind of an introduction to some of the technology, the terminology, the kiosks themselves, and the currencies themselves, as well as the fraud risks that the kiosks in particular pose. But we hope that you'll get a broad understanding of this. I don't profess to be an expert, and I wouldn't imagine people will leave with an expert tone, but hopefully we will be able to provide some very good information that will be helpful for everyone. So, what is a virtual currency? Virtual currency or digital currency, digital asset, cryptocurrency, tokens, essentially all refer to the same thing. It is an asset which uses the blockchain, which we'll explain a little bit later, to kind of proliferate itself throughout the world. And what we'll do is use virtual currency so that we can kind of keep one term that covers all of this. You can use it to send money in between individuals or businesses. You can buy products with it. You can exchange it for other virtual currencies. You can exchange it for dollar bills or other countries' currencies. You can invest it. You can use it to speculate. There's a massive market for this. Many companies have started to accept virtual currencies, but most do not. And the United States government does not view virtual currencies as actual currency, so they are not do not accept them within government agencies. You can buy it with what is called fiat currency, or what we all know as paper money, U.S. dollars, or with another type of virtual currency. Virtual currency kiosks main operation is to allow someone to put real paper dollar bills into a machine and buy virtual currency via that transaction. So why is it good? Why is it bad? I should say that, quite frankly, we don't take a position one way or the other. If people choose to use this, that's their prerogative. But why would you use it as opposed to, say, swiping your card or just using cash? Well, some people will use it to buy goods and services, like I said. There are places, grocery stores or markets that will allow you to do that. It is very fast. So if you're sending money around the world, for example, it can be done relatively quickly, almost instantaneously. It's not attached to any sort of a bank or an institution. So there's no middleman in between transactions, which some people like. Some major investors and even smaller time investors, particularly in other countries who have significantly higher rates of inflation, will use it to kind of hedge against that inflation. People invest in it. There's an entire market beyond, our traditional Wall Street market that people invest and speculate in. People who do not themselves have bank accounts, for example, might put cash that they receive, from work that they do into a cryptocurrency instead of putting it into a regular bank or keeping it under their mattress, for example. And then privacy is really one of the biggest reasons why people use it, because it's anonymous and untraceable. And this is really where we get into the area where criminals find this very effective because of the anonymity that it can provide. It's not known, there's no hard and fast figures on this, but 560 million people are estimated to hold virtual currency worldwide, and that is true for about 90 million Americans. So there's a lot of different types of cryptocurrencies or virtual currencies, and you would have heard probably of some of these, but there's tons more than you probably have ever even heard of. Bitcoin is the largest of the virtual currencies, and is the one that gets talked about the most. But Ethereum, Solana, Litecoin are some of the bigger ones. There are what are called stable coins that don't fluctuate in value. Tether, for example, is directly tied to the value of the US dollar and has become more popular as people want to use these virtual currencies for some of the reasons that I just mentioned. Um, and stable coins like Tether are more likely to be used in those instances where someone might be buying a product. And those are the kind of things that stores and some of the bigger, online marketplaces have started to accept as forms of payment. All of these virtual currencies operate on the blockchain. But what is the blockchain? Well, it's basically a very detailed bank statement. If you were to go to the cashier at the bank and make a transaction, you get a paper statement that would tell you exactly what happened. And more or less, that's what the blockchain is. It's just digital and it's public. So anyone who can get on the internet can see the blockchain and the transactions that are taking place on it. So when you make a transaction, at your bank, everything goes into a ledger, whatever you've deposited or taken out of your particular account. The blockchain is essentially a ledger that's run by computer. It's all, code, I should say, and it updates and maintains the transactions that take place. So, as an example, in a traditional system, we have our friend Alice here who tells her bank she wants $5 sent to Bob from her account to his account. And that's all reflected on the internal ledger at the bank. With the blockchain, Alice uses her computer or her iPhone to tell the network of people running the software to take $5 or the equivalent of the virtual currency that she wants to use from her account and credit it to Bob's account. And instead of accounts, we have wallets, which I will get to in a few minutes. So, what is a wallet? When people make transactions in virtual currency on the blockchain, the amount of one wallet, however much is in it, is reduced on the ledger, and the amount is increased in another wallet, and individuals own these wallets. There are two different types: a public wallet and a private wallet. Public one is basically like a bank account number, and a public one is basically a bank account number, I should say. A private wallet or private key is basically a password that only the person who has it knows, and lets the owner of it authorize the transactions specifically. A lot of people have their own individual wallets. But there are companies, particularly companies like Coinbase, which is probably one of the biggest ones, if not the biggest, who trade in virtual currencies, will hold people's wallets for them. They actually hold the private keys and control the wallets, but people can have access to them individually to use them. Going back to these virtual currency kiosks that we're going to talk about, they are generally non-custodial, so they don't have a wallet, which I will get to when we get to that portion. So I've mentioned these things a few times, and you may or may not be familiar with them. But a Bitcoin ATM or a virtual currency kiosk is a relatively new device where people can make transactions in virtual currencies. They pretty much look exactly like what we all know an ATM to be. And they're all over the place. You can probably find them at your local convenience store, gas station, some are in grocery stores. But the thing that makes these different from a regular ATM, instead of taking money out of the machine like you traditionally would do, you can use the kiosk, put money physical paper money into it, and or use your debit card or credit card and buy virtual currency right at the machine. Some of them also allow you to sell the currencies or exchange it. They charge a fee, some pretty exorbitantly, as much as 35%. So if you were to put in $1,000 into the machine, you're not actually getting $1,000 of virtual currency because the operator is taking a $350 cut of that. Traditionally, we seem to see them in the low to mid 20% range in terms of fees. Who uses these things? Which is literally the first question I asked when I heard about this topic. As I said, people who may not want to use a traditional bank or don't have access to one, instead of keeping the cash in a shoebox. It's a preferred methodology for some people because you don't really have to have a lot of identifying information to use these things. Um, Folks who get a lot of tips or work in cash could perhaps want to use them. People who are very private or like to keep their transactions private. I said before, these transactions can happen very quickly. So if it were the kind of situation where you're trying to send money across the world, that could be a reason why. And then, of course, the criminal transactions that take place. And these kiosks are often in higher crime areas, not necessarily by accident, and can be and have been used for criminal activities, including money laundering. But they're also used in fraud and scams. And in a lot of these scams that we're seeing nowadays, scams like, you get a pop-up on your computer and you call a number and they tell you you owe some money to fix it. Or there's a false romance scam where, someone online has fallen in love with you and all of a sudden needs you to pay a lot of money for them to travel or for, their lifestyle. In the past, these scammers used other means, but these kiosks are providing a quick and easy way to get money from their victims. And in 2023, according to the FBI, nearly $190 million was stolen from victims in the United States just through these kiosks alone. It's like I said, doesn't require a lot of information to be given, and so the individual who's being scammed simply has to use the machine and then send their money right to the criminal's wallet, because they'll just provide that wallet information and it's takes off in a flash. Lower and middle income folks are particularly overrepresented among kiosk users. The majority own less than $80,000 a year, and the significant portion of users of these machines tend to belong to minority groups as well. So how are these kiosks regulated? Ooh, sorry, I went too fast. So Jess, I believe you're taking over here, or did I skip ahead?
No, you covered some of the stuff that I was going to cover, but luckily we're here. And as we go through this, just a reminder, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get those responses to you. So these virtual currency kiosks are regulated at the federal level by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is called FinCEN. So these are regulated because they're considered money transmitters. And there's some other federal requirements like these kiosk owners and companies need to monitor for illicit activity or would have to report it to the regulators, the federal regulators. But what is not happening is at the state level, the regulation and the monitoring that needs to happen. And that's really why AARP in Massachusetts has started down this road to try to make some improvements to help consumers be more protected. So some states do in fact have either licensure requirements or regulations about money transmitter slash kiosks. And operators might hold these licenses in about half of the states in the country. Massachusetts is not one of those states. Law enforcement is also part of the discussion for this. How do we make sure that law enforcement knows where to have these reports so we can figure out where there is some illicit activity and then what to do about it? This is part of the discussion that we're hearing from other people who have told us this is a problem. Next slide, please. So what information is required to use a kiosk, a virtual currency kiosk? Actually, quite limited information. Most of the time, the barrier to use is very minimal. You can go to use a kiosk if you have cash or if you had a debit card. You purchase this virtual currency, as Ryan has explained. And we have seen some studies. This is a relatively new area. So we've seen some studies that show 75% of these kiosks have allowed transactions to proceed without any information other than a cell phone number. Now, that was just one study, but I think it tells us a little bit about what the types of information that are required and where there could be some better protections. Another study found that all companies, if you took them all and asked for what identifying verification they were looking at, about 87% of those companies have some additional component like a social security number or a tax ID. But consumers, by and large, can direct purchases through virtual currency to another wallet, so a digital wallet, and they don't have to have a lot of information to make that transaction. And also, there's not a lot of information that is traceable this way. So how do we keep track of that transaction that has happened? Where is the printed slip of paper, if you will? Next slide, please. Here is the most basic of how these virtual currency kiosks work. You create a virtual currency wallet. You then find the kiosk. You select the currency that you wish to transact with. You locate your wallet's QR code and you scan it, which I think more of us are becoming accustomed to using QR codes. But if you're not, that's what this little digitized image is at the top. That's called a QR code. You confirm your identification. You deposit your funds. They can either be cash or you could use a debit card to do that. You confirm the amount that you wish to buy. And then you have the virtual currency with the private key stored in the virtual currency wallet. So again, the public key is the one that is more like the account information, and the private key is more like the password if you were looking at a traditional banking system. Next slide, please. So law enforcement is investigating crimes around virtual currency kiosks. And the FTC data has shown us that fraud losses at these currency kiosks have increased nearly tenfold from 2020 to 2023. That's 3 years, tenfold. So $65 million has been um, has come from fraud and the losses just in the first half of 2024. That's a super short amount of time. And we know that law enforcement is really interested in making sure that there are some protections for consumers. Consumers like you who really need to be able to use this mechanism, if you wish, this mode of financial transaction with some certainty and some protections. So law enforcement can have some interagency cooperation. So there's interagency that could be at the state level, maybe your local police department with your state police or your district attorney, but then also with the federal side. So that's the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other federal related entities. But the idea is to make sure that there is some cross agency cooperation. And specifically around elder fraud victims, Massachusetts is one of the states, several other states have this, where people who are over a certain age, there are additional law enforcement protections for those people if they have been defrauded. There is a national elder fraud hotline, 1-833-FRAUD-11, where you can report, and also your local law enforcement agency. But here's the question: how does one get their money back if they are part of a fraudulent transaction? So you would have to fill out some forms at your local police department, and then there could be an active investigation by your local police department with your state police and law enforcement, prosecutors, district attorneys, and also trying to figure out from state and federal um, laws how to get those monies recovered. But here's the thing: if you have been defrauded and have been scammed, and someone contacts you and says that they will help you find the money that you've been defrauded, it is most likely another scam. The government does not ask you to send them money so that they can help you get the police reports filed and the money returned or possibly returned. So just be weary if you see this and you are hearing that this is a mechanism to help you recover some of your lost assets. Next slide, please. So law enforcement has some recovery processes. They are going to ask you for things like the transaction information, the address of where the currency was transmitted, the amount, and transaction hashes, which we haven't talked about, but the hash is really the tracing information that goes through the blockchain. So they would need to have this along with the dates and the times, the amounts, of course. This is all information that gets stored in the blockchain. And one of the pieces that we want to make certain that law enforcement has access to is blockchain analytics software to make sure that they can use the tools on the data side and the software side so that they can figure out where and how to trace stolen funds. And also, more importantly, maybe is, or at least equally important, is to prevent these scams in the future. Next slide, please. So here are the key takeaways. Virtual currency is used to send funds to others or to buy goods or services, or you can exchange these virtual currencies for other currencies or for investment purposes. And that is where we're at in the mode of transmission. Virtual currency is used, and the kiosks are part of that. The blockchain, which is this ledger, if you will, this ledger technology that everyone has access to if you have access to the internet. We're using the blockchain to operate and facilitate the virtual currency piece. If you want to actually go and transmit virtual currencies, you could do it through a virtual currency kiosk, which you can find in many locations, almost 300 of them in Massachusetts alone. So they look much like an ATM. Many times they're right next to an ATM. You can use your cash or your credit or your debit card and sell your money, your fiat money, that's dollars, and exchange it for different types of virtual currency. And then a major kiosk operator would have these types of machines across the country, some of which are licensed in some states, some of which follow the rules that are at the federal level. But really what we're missing, of course, is the state rules around these here in Massachusetts, and that's why we're talking with you today. And here's a piece of data that really drives part of this. Fraud losses at these currency kiosks were $189 million in 2023, and 124 million of those losses incurred for people age 60 and over. AARP is committed to helping people age with dignity and financial resilience. And our members start at age 50 and over, but what we do is really for all people to make sure that they are better able to have financial security. And so while this focus is on people 60 and over in this data point, it is not the only piece of this that we're trying to work on. So we're going to keep working on this, and this is just the start. So Ryan, I think you're up next to talk about where we're at in the state legislative process.
I am, and before I do that, we do have another poll question for folks to answer. So we've talked a lot about these scams and cryptocurrency scams in particular. Are there folks who know people or have themselves been affected by any of these scams out there? Please take a minute to answer. Well, thankfully, so far I'm seeing that quite a few people are saying no, so that's good. But there are some folks that are saying yes. Yeah, so it looks like we have a handful of people here who themselves have been affected, or at least know someone who's been affected. But glad to see that, you know, a large portion of the folks on the call today have not had to deal with this yet. But it's important, you know, I think to always be aware of the potential of these scams and frauds out there. And because these machines in particular have become so prolific across the state, um, we took it upon ourselves here at AARP to create some legislation to address some of the holes that Jess just talked about on the state level. This legislation was filed this year for the very first time in the State House by two state representatives, Kate Lippert-Garabedian and Thomas Stanley, and by Senator John Cronin. It is called an act relative to preventing fraud and establishing regulations on certain virtual currencies. And the three highlights, so to speak, are it will put regulations in place on these Bitcoin ATMs, um, many of which Jess has already addressed. But in particular, I'd like to call out the licensing requirements. It would require the operators of these machines to license them with the state so that we know who is operating them, where they're based, you know, their corporate information. It will require the operators of the machines to include warnings that the machine could potentially be used for criminal activity or fraudulent activity. Warning signs, for example, that can say, you know, are you doing this transaction because you want to, or is someone on the phone with you right now saying that you have to do this? That's what we see in a lot of these scam situations where someone will be told that they have to make this transaction right away, or something very bad could happen to them. Either their identity could be stolen, they could be imprisoned. There's frauds that take place where folks will get a call from someone purporting to be from the government and saying that unless they make a transaction right now, you know, put $1,000 into the machine or the U.S. Marshals will be knocking on your door. So warning signs that can interrupt and potentially give a person who is in the midst of a fraud an opportunity to think and react before they lose their funds. Um, it would also require that these machines give a printed receipt with all of the information that Jess mentioned, particularly the transaction hashes and the transaction information that law enforcement could then hopefully use to investigate potential crimes. It would give law enforcement the ability to access and work with the companies and have access to their analytical software so that they can track the transactions more easily. Um, it would create limits on the amount of virtual currency that could be purchased at any one time. In particular, it would put a limit at $1,000 a day. It would also put a limit on the fees that the companies can charge a consumer. Um, because a lot of times those fees, in addition to any money that they're losing in the scam, are not being refunded to them by the companies. But it would also require refunding the money because a lot of the operators, even the good ones, are believe that once the transaction takes place, even if it's a result of a fraud or a scam, that victim's money then belongs to them. And so even in instances where the actors are good in these cases, folks who are victims are not able to recover their physical cash, which they've just, put into the machine. Um, so all of these are relatively common sense regulations, would certainly put us in Massachusetts at kind of the forefront of this. There are only 3 other states that have done legislative fixes to this problem, and they all did it just last year. Um, and obviously, as this continues to grow, we need to get out ahead of the criminals. You always hear that crooks are one step ahead of the police, right? And it's no surprise that they found a piece of technology that they can use to victimize people. So we need to be proactive, and we need to get out in front of this. And this legislation does that. It would also create a commission to study the blockchain technology, and figure out kind of where it is today and where it could potentially be going in the future, so that we can try and get out in front of these issues before they arise. Um, the very first one of these machines was put in place in Massachusetts, believe it or not, all the way back in 2014. So it's not an entirely new arena, but the law and the regulations have been very slow to catch up, to where they need to be. And so there's a proactive, forward-facing component of this bill that will hopefully allow us to do that, and hopefully also allow us to find positive uses for this technology that could create more efficiencies, within state government, perhaps, and not just have to always talk about this in the negative sense. And then finally, the legislation would also instruct the state treasurer to create learning portals that folks can access online through the state government website, providing resources and educational material, particularly for older residents, about fraud prevention and kind of more generally about financial security as you age. Um, I don't think it's any surprise that a lot of people, as they get older, technology passes them by. I have a 5-year-old who can operate the computer quite a bit more effectively than I can. So it's hard to imagine a situation where 10, 20 years from now, the way things move, that there won't be some new thing that we all have to be aware of. And so again, trying to be proactive and putting resources out and available publicly where people can access them, to continue to educate so that we know what to look out for, is obviously a big and important component of this as well. And quite frankly, I know a lot of people who are on this call are actively engaged on a lot of the advocacy and legislative work that we do. So I probably don't have to tell you, but I will, that it really comes down to how many people can be supportive of these legislative efforts by reaching out to elected officials and talking about why these things matter. And if you have already done so, thank you for emailing your representatives and senators, um, telling them that they need to co-sponsor and support this bill. It really, really makes a huge difference. So that leads us into what more can we do? Um, Jess, feel free to jump in here at any time. But
Sure.
we
We're
need folks to be supportive, and how can they do that, Jess?
Well, we are butting right up to the end of the time. We still have a couple of questions that we want to get to, but here's the most important thing. If you want to be part of this, making sure that Massachusetts has some rules and some requirements to help people not be defrauded, join us. We have a great name, our Advocacy Fraud Fighters. In the next email that you receive after you end this webinar, you're going to get a follow-up. you'll be invited to a once a month meeting where you can help us. There'll be a variety of things you can do. One of the key ones is to share your personal story. If you have a personal experience with this, whether it's you or someone that you know, and we're going to give you a link so that you can see how you can do that, hopefully in a very easy way. But we really need your help. We really need your thinking. And if you can join us, we would be even better in Massachusetts at getting this done. As we said, this is the first session that we filed this legislation, but we really need this done soon. So we're counting on you. So please join us when you get the next email. Now, there's a couple of questions in chat, so I'm gonna
Yep.
go very quickly through here and see if we can get some answers. The first one is, will our current government situation, with our current government situation, how can you be sure there will be federal oversight? Well, the quick answer to that is that we cannot be certain about any proactive types of oversight, but that's why we're working in Massachusetts and in 30 states also across the country for AARP to try to make sure that we have protections at both the state and the federal level. So we're working on both sides there. How about this one to you, Ryan? Why are some virtual currencies volatile and others are stable?
Sure, it's a good question. As I mentioned, there are very many different types of these currencies. Some are particularly tied to existing financial instruments, and in particular, they're called stable coins. And Tether is the largest of those. It's tied directly to the value of the U.S. dollar. So that currency is always going to be, a one-to-one trade, whereas Bitcoin, for example, much like a stock can go up and down based on consumer interest, investment, and speculation. So there are many different types of these coins and currencies out there. Some of them are stable coins, so they're supposed to stay the same, and some of them are designed to fluctuate.
And we're right at the end of the session, so we'll just do this one last question. If we didn't get to your question, we apologize. We'll try to follow up with answers in the follow-up information. But if the blockchain is transparent and public, why is crypto considered private? Well, it's because it does offer some anonymity. There isn't, the information does not get recorded in the same way that the blockchain does, which is information on the internet. So it's a very quick response to that. It is certainly not the whole response. So
As
we
as I said in the beginning, this is a complicated topic, and we don't expect anybody to walk away as an expert. But what we hope is that we were able to provide some specific information that's been valuable to you. As I said, everybody who's been able to attend will get a follow-up email with the information that we provided, a recording of this session, as well as links to that we've discussed. We hope that you will join us going forward, and you will get a link to the monthly meeting about fraud and about the advocacy work and ways that you can be involved. We have a lot of different things that we're planning for this year. If you can join us, we would love to have you. Your being a part of this is what will be able to make us be successful and get the regulations in place that will help protect everyone across the state.
thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.